The email landed in the inbox at an odd hour. It wasn't one of those casual, business-as-usual messages. It wasn't even polite, in the sense of mundane professionalism. It was audacious, direct, and utterly unignorable. The subject line alone made eyebrows raise. Me. The next James Bond. You can imagine the scene in the studio office. The quiet hum of computers, half-empty coffee cups, and then, that line, like a lightning bolt through the glass windows of Hollywood ambition. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now, let's pause for a second. Imagine being on the other end. You're one of the most experienced producers in the business, someone who has shepherded franchises, turned scripts into box office gold, and seen stars rise and fall like the tides. And then, in the middle of your regular Monday morning chaos, a figure known for her meticulous branding and relentless media presence sends you a pitch that is, in the strictest sense, insane. How do you even respond? How do you even process it without laughing, crying, or questioning every career choice that has led you to this moment? It wasn't just the content of the email. It was the confidence, the unshakable belief that Hollywood might bend, just this once, to her whims. And it wasn't the first time this kind of thing had happened, though it was certainly one of the boldest. We're talking about a figure who has mastered the art of media attention, whose every move is dissected, analyzed, and circulated with lightning speed. When she makes a play for something as iconic as James Bond, it doesn't just make waves. It causes seismic tremors across the industry. But before we dive deeper, let me ask you this. What makes someone think they can step into a role that has been cemented in the public imagination for decades? A role that is almost sacred in its continuity? And more importantly, what happens when that ambition collides head-on with the reality of studio gatekeeping, corporate politics, and a producer who has seen it all? This story is not just about ambition. It's about audacity, ego, Hollywood power plays. And yes, it's about the emails that no one expected to exist, and the reactions they sparked behind closed doors. The audacity alone is enough to make any insider pause. But what really made this story impossible to ignore was the response. Because the response wasn't polite. It wasn't even subtle. It was scathing, meticulous, and dripping with the kind of judgment that can make or break reputations. It was as if every carefully honed public persona, every polished interview, every meticulously curated social media post, had led to this single moment of reckoning. And for those watching from the outside, it was a rare glimpse behind the velvet curtain of Hollywood's inner workings. Let's zoom in for a moment on the producer at the center of this storm. This is someone whose fingerprints are on some of the most successful cinematic universes in modern history. Someone who has been both praised and criticized for her ruthlessness, her vision, and her ability to spot talent, or spot trouble, long before anyone else sees it. For her, the email was not just a message. It was a test, a challenge, and perhaps a chance to remind the world, and the sender, that in Hollywood, audacity alone does not equate to achievement. The studio itself had been no stranger to drama. In a city where every pitch is a calculated risk and every star is a potential headline, internal politics are a daily reality. Executives debate, strategize, and sometimes collide in ways that make corporate boardrooms look like gladiator arenas. And when an email like this lands on someone's desk, it doesn't just sit there. It triggers a cascade of whispers, meetings, and clandestine conversations that can shape careers in an instant. For anyone reading this story, the question becomes, what happens next? And more importantly, who controls the narrative? There's something inherently fascinating about audacious proposals, especially when they involve some of the most watched figures in the world. Because the public rarely sees the tension, the strategy, the judgment calls that happen behind the scenes. What you do see is the outcome, the press releases, the media stories, the headlines, carefully sculpted to give the illusion of seamless control. But here, in this story, you are about to see the opposite. You are about to see hesitation, shock, the kind of incredulity that only comes when reality fails to match expectation. And let's not underestimate the stakes. This isn't just about one email or one request. It's about power dynamics, reputation management, and the very real consequences of misjudging the intricacies of Hollywood politics. Studios are not just production houses. They are microcosms of negotiation, influence, and sometimes ruthless judgment. One misstep, one ill-advised email, one audacious claim can shift public perception and internal alliances alike. It's a delicate ecosystem, one that is often hidden from the public eye, yet whose effects ripple outward with astonishing speed. Here's where the story gets even more compelling. Because while the email itself is shocking, it's only part of the narrative. Behind it lies a network of assumptions, expectations, and histories that shape every decision. Every line in that message carries weight beyond its words. The sender's prior actions, media presence, and carefully cultivated persona all play a role in how it is received. And the producer, experienced and unflinching, is not someone who reacts lightly to any of this. The response, scathing, measured, and unforgettable, becomes a turning point, not just for the sender, but for everyone who witnesses it. So why should you care? Why does this matter beyond Hollywood gossip? Because it is a masterclass in ambition, audacity, and the limits of influence. It is a real-time demonstration of how perception and reality collide, how power is wielded behind closed doors, and how a single communication can trigger a domino effect across an industry. And for those of us watching from the outside, it's a rare glimpse into a world where every action is amplified, every misstep is scrutinized, and every bold claim carries consequences that extend far beyond the inbox. But even as we dissect the dynamics, the questions linger. How did this email come to be sent in the first place? What drove the sender to believe that this was a battle she could win? And how did someone at the top of the Hollywood hierarchy craft a response that would both neutralize the audacity and assert authority, all while maintaining an air of control over a narrative that could have spun wildly out of hand? As we journey into the chapters ahead, you will discover the layers behind this seemingly simple exchange. We'll explore the history, the personalities, and the subtle power plays that define this moment. You will meet the figures involved, not just as caricatures of celebrity, but as complex individuals navigating a labyrinthine industry where strategy, timing, and perception are everything. You'll witness decisions that seem small in isolation but reveal themselves to be pivotal in the broader story of ambition, influence, and Hollywood reality. And finally, you'll be left with one lingering thought, a question that hovers over every revelation, every dramatic turn, every calculated move. How far can audacity truly take you in a world built on image, influence, and tradition? What happens when ambition meets experience, when boldness collides with authority? And perhaps most importantly, what comes next when the stakes are higher than anyone imagined, and no one is quite sure who will emerge unscathed? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. It started innocuously enough. A ping from the inbox, a notification that any executive in Hollywood knows could mean anything from a routine script update to a pressing crisis. But this time, it wasn't routine. The subject line was almost laughable in its audacity. Me. The next James Bond. 3 words. That's all it took to send a ripple through a studio accustomed to calculated risk and measured ego. You can almost picture it. The producer sitting back in her chair, eyes narrowing, fingers hovering over the keyboard, as the gravity of those 3 words sank in. And here's where we have to pause. Because before you dismiss this as just another celebrity overreach, consider the context. This wasn't an unknown actor, some fledgling talent seeking a break. No, this was someone whose name alone carried weight in the tabloids, in streaming news cycles, in international recognition. A person who has turned every appearance, every interview, every social media post into a carefully curated persona. Someone who understood the mechanisms of fame and the levers of power in a way few ever do. And yet, even with all that experience, the boldness of this particular request was staggering. So why James Bond? Why stake such an audacious claim on a role so sacrosanct, so untouchable in its cinematic legacy? The answer, in part, lies in perception. James Bond is more than a character. It is an institution, a symbol of sophistication, daring, and a global standard of charisma. To declare oneself a candidate for that role is to stake a claim not just on a part, but on an entire mythology. And in Hollywood, mythology matters. Studios do not just sell films. They sell dreams, they sell continuity, they sell narratives that the public has come to accept as inviolable. Anyone attempting to insert themselves into that narrative without invitation is, by definition, audacious. The producer in question had seen her fair share of audacity. She had watched fledgling directors pitch scripts that would never see the light of day. Actors insist on rewrites that would doom entire franchises, and talent agents attempt to manipulate the system to suit their clients' whims. But this email, it was different. It carried an undertone of entitlement, a certainty that the world would bend around the sender's ambition. And in Hollywood, certainty without precedent is dangerous, because the industry runs on a mixture of risk, intuition, and reputation. Cross the wrong line, and even the most dazzling persona can implode overnight. Now, let's visualize the scene inside the office. The producer leans back, the weight of decades of experience pressing against her instincts. The room is quiet, punctuated only by the occasional hum of a computer and the distant chatter of assistants. She reads the email once, twice, maybe even a third time. Every word is measured, carefully crafted, designed to communicate both confidence and inevitability. And yet, every word is also a test of reaction, of authority, of the invisible hierarchy that governs the studio ecosystem. At this point, you might wonder, what goes through a person's mind when they read something this audacious? How does one respond when a figure with immense public visibility essentially challenges the norms of an entire franchise? The producer has options, but none are simple. Ignore it and risk seeming dismissive. Reply and risk engaging with a potentially catastrophic scenario. Escalate it to internal meetings and risk inviting gossip and scrutiny. Every choice carries consequences, and in Hollywood, consequences are magnified exponentially. The initial reaction, as sources would later reveal, was a mixture of incredulity and strategic calculation. There is a long-standing rule in entertainment that audacity must be acknowledged, but carefully managed. If you overreact, you fuel the narrative you're trying to control. If you underreact, you risk being seen as ineffective. And this email, audacious as it was, required a response that would simultaneously neutralize the boldness, assert authority, and maintain professional boundaries, all without inflaming the very public audience that watched every move from the sidelines. The story doesn't end with just the email, of course. The intrigue deepens when we consider what happened behind the scenes. Assistants whispered, executives convened impromptu huddles, and every line of the email was dissected for subtext. Was it arrogance? A marketing stunt? A genuine belief in the possibility of casting the sender as 007? Or something more layered, a test of influence, a gambit designed to provoke a reaction that could be leveraged in future negotiations? The layers are endless, and that is precisely what makes this story compelling. It's also critical to understand the culture into which this email was sent. Hollywood, despite its glamorous facade, is a place of strict hierarchies and unspoken rules. Power is currency, and influence is earned through reputation, negotiation, and sometimes sheer timing. The producer, with years of experience navigating these waters, recognizes that a misstep here could resonate far beyond the inbox. One poorly chosen word could become a headline, a viral meme, or the opening salvo in a media storm. Conversely, a carefully calculated response could reinforce authority, protect intellectual property, and subtly remind the sender and the world of who really controls the narrative. And yet, there is an almost cinematic tension in the story. Picture it, a legendary figure in studio production, renowned for both vision and ruthlessness, sitting alone with a laptop. The cursor blinks mockingly. Outside, the city hums with the rhythm of ambition, fame, and celebrity. Every option seems fraught with peril, every decision carries weight. And somewhere in the mix, the sender of the email waits. Oblivious to the strategic calculus unfolding behind closed doors, or perhaps entirely aware, relishing the audacity of her move. Now, let's consider the psychology at play. Ambition is intoxicating. The sender believes, not unreasonably, that her skills, her presence, and her global visibility justify the audacious claim. But ambition collides with reality. Reality, in Hollywood terms, is the gatekeeping mechanisms that protect franchises, the studios that calculate risk with surgical precision, and the executives who have built careers on mastering these dynamics. The email, in essence, is a collision between personal belief and institutional control, a moment that exposes the tension between what a star thinks they can achieve and what the system is willing to allow. The story's tension heightens further when we examine the response. What followed the initial incredulity was a meticulously crafted reaction that combined wit, authority, and subtle warning. It was not simply a dismissal. It was a narrative-defining move. Behind the scenes, those familiar with the dynamic say the response was simultaneously scathing and instructional, a reminder that Hollywood is a place where confidence alone does not equal influence. Every word, every sentence, every pause was calculated to send a message without spilling the private deliberations to the world. And here is where we reach the first cliffhanger of our narrative. Because even after the initial response, even after the whispers in the hallways and the quiet calculations behind closed doors, no one could have predicted the ripple effects. Every party involved, from executives to assistants to PR teams, suddenly became part of a drama that no one had auditioned for. The audacity of the original email had triggered a chain reaction that would touch careers, reputations, and media narratives in ways that could not have been foreseen. So what happens next? How does a studio manage an audacious challenge from one of the most visible figures in global media? How does a producer balance authority, risk, and the public eye in a situation that could spiral out of control at any moment? These questions are not rhetorical. They are the heartbeat of this story. And as we move into the next chapter, you will witness the first dominoes fall. Conversations behind closed doors escalate, strategies are debated, and the people at the center of the storm begin to realize that nothing in Hollywood is ever simple, especially when audacity meets experience. But just as the tension begins to settle, an unexpected twist emerges, one that no one saw coming. A small decision, a seemingly trivial exchange, becomes the spark for a confrontation that will redefine everything. And for those watching, the anticipation grows. Who will emerge unscathed? And who will be forced to reckon with the consequences of ambition that dared to challenge a system decades in the making? What came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The room was quiet, almost too quiet for a place usually humming with decisions, deadlines, and drama. Yet in that silence, the weight of anticipation was almost tangible. A single email had disrupted the equilibrium of one of the world's most powerful studios, a studio that had seen every kind of crisis imaginable, from blockbuster flops to star scandals. And now, this, a bold, audacious request that could only be described as a challenge to the very hierarchy of Hollywood influence. Imagine it for a moment. You are sitting in that room, one of the most experienced producers in the business, decades of blockbuster franchises and career-making decisions behind you. And now, an email lands on your desk that defies all precedent. The audacity is staggering, almost theatrical. What do you do first? Laugh, shake your head, panic silently, and wonder how quickly this could spin into a media storm? Or do you step into your role as the arbiter of power and calculate your every move like a chess master anticipating 10 steps ahead? This is the paradox of Hollywood. It is glamorous, flashy, and glittering on the outside. But on the inside, it is a complex web of negotiations, hierarchies, and unspoken rules. Decisions are rarely made in isolation. Every word matters. Every pause, every glance, every carefully curated reaction can ripple through the media ecosystem in ways few can predict. The email, audacious as it was, had triggered exactly that, a cascade of strategic deliberation that would soon reveal the subtle, ruthless machinery of the studio system. Let's zoom in on the key players. The producer, known for her uncanny ability to navigate Hollywood's shifting sands, convened a closed-door meeting. Attendees included senior executives, legal advisors, PR strategists, and creative heads. Each had a role in analyzing the implications of the email. Each had a vested interest in controlling the narrative. As the discussion unfolded, the room was filled with tension that could almost be cut with a knife. Every voice was weighed carefully, every opinion noted and considered. This was not a brainstorming session. This was a high-stakes exercise in containment, strategy, and control. The question that dominated the room was deceptively simple. How do we respond? On one side, there was the risk of underreaction, allowing the audacity of the email to set a precedent that could embolden others, potentially destabilizing the carefully maintained order of franchise casting. On the other side was the risk of overreaction, creating headlines, leaks, or viral content that could paint the studio as petty, vindictive, or unprofessional. And in the middle of it all was a human element that cannot be quantified: ego, ambition. The undeniable reality that someone with influence and visibility believes, perhaps sincerely, that she is the rightful contender for a role that had long been protected by tradition and corporate strategy. As the discussions intensified, the strategies proposed were both fascinating and revealing. Some executives argued for a strictly formal response, a polite, almost dismissive acknowledgement, designed to maintain professional boundaries without inflaming the situation. Others advocated for a more forceful approach, one that would assert authority, clarify the impossibility of the request, and subtly remind the sender of the realities of studio decision-making. And then there were those who suggested something more creative, something theatrical, leveraging the audacity of the request to generate publicity while simultaneously protecting the franchise. Each option carried profound implications, both immediate and long-term. And while these internal debates raged, the producers were acutely aware of the broader stakes. Hollywood is a place where image is everything. Every actor, every executive, every decision is scrutinized by an audience of millions. Public perception can enhance or destroy reputations in an instant. The media thrives on audacity, conflict, and spectacle, and this email, intentionally or not, had all three. The challenge was clear: craft a response that would neutralize the audacity, preserve authority, and protect the studio's long-term interests, all while anticipating how the public, the press, and the industry at large might interpret the exchange. Now, consider the psychology at play. The sender of the email, with her global recognition and carefully honed public persona, had created a moment of tension that relied on expectation. She assumed confidence would compel action. She assumed audacity would provoke a reaction favorable to her ambitions. But Hollywood operates differently. In this industry, ego must always meet strategy. Ambition without timing, without understanding the subtle currents of influence, can be dangerous. And the producer, seasoned and shrewd, understood this perfectly. She saw the email not as a personal affront, but as a challenge to be managed with precision, calculation, and poise. The room was alive with strategy. Legal advisors dissected each phrase of the email, considering implications for contract law, intellectual property, and studio liability. PR strategists evaluated potential public reactions, media narratives, and the ways the conversation might be interpreted if it leaked. Creative heads analyzed the implications for the franchise, the character of James Bond, and the potential backlash from fans and critics alike. Every angle was considered, every scenario played out mentally, and every possible outcome weighed with the gravity it deserved. And yet, despite the layers of analysis, there was an undeniable human element in the room. Tension, frustration, curiosity, even a hint of amusement, threaded through the discussions. Hollywood is, after all, a human industry. Decisions are influenced by perception, instinct, and personality as much as by data or precedent. The producer, standing at the center, had to navigate not only the audacity of the email, but also the personalities in the room, the power dynamics at play, and the invisible pressure of global attention. At this point, it's worth asking, how often does the public get to see the machinery behind these moments? The truth is, rarely. Most audiences see the final product, the headline, the statement, the carefully polished interview. What is invisible is the negotiation, the debate, the strategic calculation, and the subtle maneuvers that determine how a narrative unfolds. This story, unlike most, provides a window into that hidden world, a world where influence, audacity, and experience collide in ways that can shape careers, franchises, and media narratives. And just as the strategy session reached its peak, an unexpected variable entered the equation. A junior assistant, relatively new to the studio, offered a perspective that had not been considered. A single observation, almost casual in tone, illuminated a potential risk the executives had overlooked: the viral potential of the email if leaked, the possibility of fan backlash, and the ways in which social media could amplify a narrative beyond the studio's control. Suddenly, the stakes shifted. What had seemed like a contained, high-level deliberation now threatened to spill into public consciousness, forcing the team to rethink assumptions and reconsider every proposed course of action. It was a moment that captured the paradox of Hollywood perfectly. The audacity of the sender collided with the experience of the producer, creating a scenario that was simultaneously controlled and unpredictable. Every choice carried potential reward and risk. Every decision shaped not only the immediate outcome, but the perception of the studio, the franchise, and the individuals involved. And as the room continued to debate, the sense of anticipation grew. Every person present knew that the next few hours would define not just the response to the email, but the larger narrative that would unfold in public view. And then, the unexpected happened. A senior executive, known for her pragmatism and cool demeanor, proposed a move that would alter the trajectory of the situation entirely. It was bold, unconventional, and potentially risky, a reflection of the very audacity that had sparked this story in the first place. The room fell silent. Every eye turned to the producer, the decision-maker at the heart of the storm. Would she approve the move? Would she recognize the potential brilliance or see only the danger? The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever, and the outcome uncertain. But here is where the chapter leaves us, on the edge of revelation, at the moment when strategy, audacity, and authority collide. The decision made in that quiet room, behind closed doors, would set the tone for everything that followed. It would determine how the audacious request was perceived, how the media narrative unfolded, and how those involved navigated the treacherous waters of Hollywood ambition. What came next would defy expectations, reshape alliances, and reveal just how fragile power can be, even in the most seemingly controlled environments. Hollywood thrives on audacity. It is the lifeblood of the industry, the fuel that transforms ideas into blockbusters and launches unknown actors into stardom overnight. Yet, audacity is a double-edged sword. When wielded with skill, it opens doors. When miscalculated, it can burn bridges faster than a leaked scandal headline. And the email in question? It was a textbook example of audacity, bold, provocative, impossible to ignore, and yet filled with peril. Let's unpack it, because understanding the anatomy of this request is crucial to understanding why the response that followed was so remarkable. The subject line alone, the next James Bond, was shocking in its simplicity and audacity. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't phrased as a question or a possibility. It was declarative, almost commanding, a direct assertion of intent. And in Hollywood, the way a request is framed often matters as much as the request itself. Consider the psychology behind such a move. The sender, globally recognized, has spent years cultivating a persona built on media mastery, public visibility, and strategic attention. Every interview, every appearance, every social media post contributes to a carefully orchestrated narrative of influence and relevance. For someone operating within this sphere, claiming a role like James Bond isn't just ambition. It is a calculated power move. It signals confidence, audacity, and the belief that visibility alone can sway institutional barriers. But here is where Hollywood's machinery complicates the equation. James Bond is not just a role, it is an institution. Casting decisions are meticulously controlled, shaped by decades of franchise strategy, contractual obligations, and public expectation. A single audacious claim, no matter how media-savvy the sender, collides with a structure designed to preserve continuity and control. And that collision, ambition versus institution, is the essence of the drama at hand. Now, imagine being the recipient of this email. A veteran producer, someone who has shepherded blockbuster franchises and managed some of the industry's most high-profile talent. For her, the audacity of the request is not just a professional challenge. It is a test of judgment, authority, and poise. Every word, every pause, every decision must be calibrated to assert control without escalating a situation that could easily become a media spectacle. And the stakes are enormous. One misstep could result in a viral story, a public backlash, or a perception that the studio allowed audacity to dictate decisions. The email's content was audacious in more ways than one. Beyond the declarative subject line, the tone conveyed an expectation of entitlement. There was a subtle insistence, a confidence bordering on arrogance, that the role should be accessible simply because the sender desired it. This is a classic feature of audacity, the blending of ambition and perceived inevitability. The sender isn't asking, they are asserting. And the brilliance, or the danger, of audacity is that it forces the recipient to react, to choose between confrontation, diplomacy, or subtle manipulation of the narrative. Behind closed doors, the producer recognized these dynamics immediately. She did not see the email as a mere communication. She saw it as a strategic maneuver. And in Hollywood, strategy is everything. The challenge is not simply deciding whether the request is plausible. It is managing perception, controlling narrative, and asserting authority without inflaming ego or attracting unwanted attention. One word too many, one tone misjudged, and the carefully balanced ecosystem of studio politics can collapse. But let's step back and ask a critical question. Why would someone make such a claim in the first place? Audacity in Hollywood is rarely reckless. It is often calculated. The sender likely recognized the potential risks. Viral criticism, ridicule, professional pushback, and weighed them against the potential reward, attention, influence, or even a small chance of leverage over a franchise that defines global pop culture. This calculus, audacity as strategy, is the foundation of modern celebrity influence. And yet, as bold as the email was, it underestimated the experience, insight, and control exercised by those on the receiving end. The anatomy of audacity also includes timing. Timing, in Hollywood, can be everything. Releases, casting decisions, media cycles. Each element operates within a precise temporal framework. To send an email of such ambition at a moment when the studio is navigating strategic priorities is to introduce a variable that cannot be ignored. And as the producer reviewed the message, she understood not only the audacity but the timing, the optics, and the subtle implications for the franchise and for public perception. Now, consider the ripple effect. Once the email is read, it is no longer a private communication. It becomes a vector for speculation. Internal staff begin to whisper, legal advisors consider potential consequences, PR strategists envision headlines, and the studio leadership convenes to strategize. Every stakeholder in this ecosystem is aware that perception is often more consequential than reality. And that is why audacity, even in the form of a simple email, has the power to shape decisions, influence strategy, and dominate conversation in ways that go far beyond the original intent. The story grows even more intricate when we examine the subtleties of tone and phrasing. The email, while confident, was not overtly confrontational. There was no insult, no provocation, only assertion. That is a hallmark of sophisticated audacity. The ability to push boundaries without directly triggering defensive responses. It is a delicate dance, one that can succeed brilliantly or backfire catastrophically. And the producer, acutely aware of these nuances, knew that her response had to be equally measured, strategically calibrated, and psychologically precise. So what is the takeaway from this moment, beyond the drama? It is that audacity is both a tool and a test. It reveals character, intention, and strategic thinking. Not just in the sender, but in the recipient. How a studio handles such a request, how a producer responds to an audacious challenge, illuminates the dynamics of power, authority, and influence that define Hollywood behind the glittering facade of premieres and press tours. But the email itself is only the beginning. The reactions, the discussions, the internal debates, these are where the story truly unfolds. As the producer strategized, she considered every potential consequence, every possible interpretation, and every hidden agenda. She knew that a miscalculation could reverberate across the industry, affecting not just the sender, but the studio's reputation, the franchise's integrity, and the careers of countless individuals. And here is the twist that most audiences would never see. While the world outside would later speculate about motives, personalities, and potential scandal, the real drama was quietly, meticulously unfolding behind closed doors. Every conversation, every strategy session, every consideration of tone and phrasing was part of a high-stakes negotiation that had nothing to do with publicity and everything to do with authority. The audacity of the email had forced a test of leadership, judgment, and control. And the stakes could not have been higher. By the time the first response was drafted, every word had been considered, every implication debated, and every potential consequence mapped. The producer understood that her reply would do more than address a request. It would define the boundaries of power, reinforce the hierarchy, and subtly remind the sender, and anyone watching, that audacity must be tempered by experience. In Hollywood, every communication carries weight, and a single misstep can become a defining moment in the public imagination. And so, as the fingers hovered over the keyboard and the cursor blinked patiently, the stage was set for the first dramatic confrontation in this saga. The audacity of the request, the experience of the producer, and the unseen dynamics of Hollywood power were converging. It was a moment of tension, anticipation, and uncertainty. A moment that would reveal just how fragile perception and authority can be, even among the most seasoned players. But just as the email was about to be answered, an unexpected complication arose. A leak, a miscommunication, or perhaps an unforeseen intervention. Details remain murky, threatened to expose the situation to external scrutiny. Suddenly, what had been a controlled, private negotiation teetered on the edge of public spectacle. The producer realized that the response would not only address the sender, but would also preempt a potential media firestorm. Every decision now carried amplified stakes, and the smallest error could ignite consequences no one anticipated. What happened next would test the producer's mastery of strategy, the audacity of the sender, and the unpredictable power of Hollywood perception. And as the studio braced for the fallout, one question loomed over every mind in that room. Who truly controls the narrative when audacity collides with experience? And can anyone survive the consequences unscathed? The tension in the studio was palpable. It wasn't the type of tension that makes for a dramatic scene in a film. It was real, quiet, and suffocating, the kind that grips a room when power, reputation, and perception all hang by a thread. In the executive conference room, decisions were being made that could affect the trajectory of careers, franchises, and global narratives. Outside, the Hollywood lights glittered, masking the anxiety that crackled behind the glass walls. Every executive, every assistant, every strategist was aware of the stakes, and every one of them understood that a single misstep could ignite a storm beyond anyone's control. Let's step inside the room, because this is where the story truly deepens. The senior producer sat at the head of the table, laptop open, fingers poised, eyes scanning the faces around her. She had seen audacity before, sure, but never like this. This wasn't a standard pitch. It wasn't a misguided attempt at attention-seeking. This was a carefully orchestrated statement, a direct challenge to a hierarchy that had remained unchallenged for decades. And now, it demanded not only a response, but a strategy, a containment plan, and a clear assertion of authority. All executed flawlessly. What makes this moment so fascinating and so instructive for anyone trying to understand Hollywood is the interplay between power and perception. The email had done its job. It forced everyone in that room to stop, assess, and strategize. But it also revealed weaknesses, subtle vulnerabilities in the system, and unspoken dynamics that only insiders fully understand. Who wields influence? Who controls the narrative? Who is expected to make the final decision? And crucially, how does one respond to audacity without feeding it or undermining authority? These are questions that the average audience rarely contemplates, yet they define the outcome of Hollywood dramas before cameras even roll. The senior executives leaned forward, each offering a perspective shaped by years of experience, tempered by the pressure of maintaining control. Legal advisors highlighted potential risks, contract implications, intellectual property rights, and the possibility of unintended precedent. PR strategists explored the optics, how the email might be leaked, interpreted, or weaponized in social media discussions. Creative directors debated the artistic and brand implications, how the sanctity of an iconic franchise could be maintained, and how audience expectations must be balanced against unpredictable celebrity influence. And through it all, the producer observed, calculated, and weighed every word. She knew instinctively that her response would do more than address the email. It would signal authority, reinforce boundaries, and shape perception, not just for the sender, but for the entire ecosystem watching quietly from the sidelines. Every decision carried a ripple effect, and in Hollywood, ripples can become tidal waves overnight. Let's pause for a moment. Ask yourself, how often do you consider the machinery behind a single decision in Hollywood? The drama you see on red carpets, in press interviews, or on streaming platforms is only the tip of an iceberg. Beneath the surface is a world of negotiation, strategy, and silent tension. A single email, when audacious enough, can expose this machinery, revealing a complex choreography of power, calculation, and control that most audiences never glimpse. Inside the room, debates intensified. Some executives argued for a blunt, assertive response, something that would leave no doubt about authority and prevent any future attempts to challenge the franchise hierarchy. Others advocated for subtlety, suggesting that diplomacy and restraint would better protect relationships and public perception. Still others proposed a hybrid approach, combining firmness with tact, authority with subtle humor, and a clear message without inviting sensationalism. It was a delicate balancing act, one that could determine the trajectory of both the franchise and the careers entwined in the situation. And here's where the psychology gets fascinating. The sender of the email, with her public mastery of image and media, had likely anticipated a reaction somewhere between surprise and resistance. But did she truly understand the depth of calculation happening behind closed doors? Could she anticipate the subtle power plays, the weighing of optics, the delicate navigation of ego, authority, and public perception? Perhaps, or perhaps the audacity of her claim was exactly the gambit. To provoke a reaction, test boundaries, and see who could rise to the challenge. Either way, the producers were playing a high-stakes game of strategic chess, and every move mattered. The studio itself added another layer of complexity. This was not merely a private negotiation. It was a moment where institutional culture, franchise strategy, and brand management collided with individual ambition. In Hollywood, the studio's reputation is a currency as valuable as talent or box office performance. Protecting that reputation requires precision, foresight, and occasionally, ruthlessness. And when audacity threatens to breach that carefully maintained order, decisions must be made quickly, decisively, and with a keen understanding of both internal and external consequences. While discussions continued, the room was also alive with subtle tension between personalities. Power dynamics, loyalty, ambition, and ego all played a role in how suggestions were received, how counterpoints were raised, and how final judgments were formed. In such environments, influence is rarely absolute. Even seasoned executives must negotiate not only with the external challenge, but with the internal ecosystem, the assistants, advisors, and colleagues whose opinions carry weight and whose perception of competence can influence final outcomes. And then came the unexpected factor. An unplanned leak. Perhaps it was a slip of conversation, a forwarded message, or an eager assistant trying to signal insight. Whatever it was, suddenly, the private deliberation threatened to spill into the public domain. Social media, gossip columns, and media outlets are lightning fast, and even the hint of audacity from a globally recognized figure can become a headline before the studio has a chance to react. The implications were immediate and chilling. One misstep, one poorly considered line of response, and the carefully controlled environment could implode under the weight of speculation, criticism, and viral attention. At that moment, the producer's mastery of strategy became evident. She understood that containment required more than simply crafting a clever email. It required narrative control, preemptive measures, and anticipation of every potential scenario. Every option was evaluated for risk. Would a direct rejection provoke a media firestorm? Could a diplomatically vague response encourage further audacity? Might humor be misinterpreted as weakness? The stakes were enormous, and the room collectively recognized that the next decision would echo far beyond the immediate context. And as the deliberations reached their climax, a decision was made. The response would be firm, precise, and controlled. but with a subtle undertone that conveyed experience, authority, and the kind of confidence that only comes from decades of navigating Hollywood's treacherous waters. Every word was carefully weighed, every punctuation mark considered, and every possible interpretation predicted in advance. It was more than a reply. It was a statement, one that would define power, audacity, and authority in this delicate ecosystem. Yet even as the message was prepared, the room remained tense. No one could predict exactly how it would be received or what the immediate reaction would be. The sender, accustomed to controlling media narratives and public perception, might respond unpredictably. Allies might weigh in publicly. Leaks might occur. And in Hollywood, even the most meticulously crafted strategy is vulnerable to the chaos of human behavior. So here we are at a crucial juncture. A single email has revealed the hidden machinery of influence, strategy, and control. Behind closed doors, a battle of wits, authority, and perception unfolds. Careers, reputations, and the integrity of a global franchise hang in the balance. And as the studio braces for the immediate consequences, one question lingers above all else. Can audacity truly be contained when it has been unleashed into the ecosystem of power, ambition, and perception? But as the first response was finally sent, another twist emerged. One that would set off a chain reaction no one in that room had anticipated. And that twist would redefine not only the trajectory of this saga, but the very rules of engagement in Hollywood power plays. What came next would upend expectations, reveal hidden alliances, and force everyone involved to confront the true cost of audacity. The cursor blinked one last time before the producer pressed send. It was not a reaction born of emotion or frustration. It was calculated, deliberate, and precise. Years of experience, decades of navigating Hollywood's complex power structures, culminated in this moment. One carefully crafted message would define authority, set boundaries, and control a narrative that had the potential to spiral far beyond the walls of the studio. Let's be clear, the stakes were immense. The audacity of the initial email was not just a challenge, it was a provocation. It demanded acknowledgement, demanded a response, and demanded that the power dynamic be firmly established. And in Hollywood, power dynamics are everything. They dictate casting, influence careers, and shape public perception. One misstep in tone or timing could ignite a media firestorm, or worse, embolden future attempts to bypass protocol and hierarchy. But here's where it gets fascinating. The producer's response was not a mere rejection. It was an exercise in psychological strategy, a masterclass in controlling perception while subtly asserting authority. Every word had been considered, every phrase calibrated. The tone walked a razor-thin line between firmness and diplomacy. There was no condescension, no mockery, no overt hostility, but the message made one thing unmistakably clear. Audacity could be acknowledged, but it would not dictate outcomes. Behind the scenes, the studio held its collective breath. Assistants hovered near phones, PR teams calculated every potential headline, and executives reviewed the text as if it were a script scene, analyzing its impact, emotional weight, and clarity. This wasn't a casual correspondence. It was a public relations and strategic chess move wrapped in a private email. And in Hollywood, such moments are rarer than they seem. The public sees the headlines, the drama, the viral stories, but they rarely witness the orchestration behind them. Now, consider the perspective of the sender. The initial email had been audacious, confident, even daring. But the response, measured, precise, and authoritative, forced a confrontation with reality. It reminded the sender that visibility does not equate to influence, that audacity must be matched with strategy, and that the machinery of Hollywood is not swayed by bold declarations alone. This is a lesson few understand until they face it head-on. In an ecosystem defined by hierarchy, history, and carefully controlled perception, experience often outweighs bravado. The content of the response itself is instructive. Without revealing specifics, sources describe it as concise, firm, and unambiguous. It acknowledged the email, recognized the sender's visibility, and then set clear parameters. The franchise was guided by decades of planning, by institutional rules, and by strategic vision that could not be circumvented by audacious requests. Tone and phrasing were critical. A single misplaced word could have conveyed sarcasm, disrespect, or condescension, each of which could be weaponized in the court of public opinion. But beyond the words themselves, the response carried subtle signals. Confidence, authority, experience. The kind of authority that comes from having successfully navigated countless high-stakes situations, having managed egos, crises, and media narratives with unflinching precision. It was not merely a rejection. It was a statement of control, a demonstration that audacity would be met with calm mastery rather than emotional reaction. Consider the internal impact. The response set off a chain reaction of reflection and analysis within the studio. Executives and assistants alike began to appreciate the delicate dance of authority, perception, and messaging at play. This single email exchange became a case study in strategic communication, a reminder that in Hollywood, mastery of the unseen machinery. The power dynamics, the timing, and the narrative framing can outweigh even the boldest public gesture. And yet, the story does not stop with internal approval. As the message landed in the sender's inbox, the potential for unforeseen reaction loomed large. Hollywood is unpredictable, and even the most calculated response can spark ripple effects beyond anticipation. How would the sender interpret the tone? Would she accept the boundaries set? Or would she push further, leveraging her visibility and media savvy to test limits once more? The uncertainty of human behavior, amplified by fame, ambition, and public scrutiny, added tension that could not be ignored. This moment is also a lesson in timing. Responses are rarely just about content. They are about rhythm. When to send, how long to pause before replying, and what secondary communications might accompany the primary response all matter. The producer understood this intuitively. By controlling timing as carefully as phrasing, she ensured that the response maintained authority, minimized misinterpretation, and strategically positioned the studio to manage any fallout. Timing, in this context, became as important as the words themselves. And there's another layer to consider: perception outside the room. Hollywood operates under the relentless gaze of the media. A single email, or even the hint of one, can be amplified into a headline, a trending story, or a social media storm. The producer's strategy accounted not only for the sender's reaction, but also for potential leaks, rumors, and misinterpretations. Every word, carefully chosen, acted as both response and preemptive defense, protecting the studio's reputation while reinforcing authority behind the scenes. But here's the twist. While the response was masterful, it didn't completely resolve the tension. In fact, it created new dynamics. The sender, accustomed to navigating public narratives with skill, now faced an unprecedented demonstration of controlled authority. The audacity that had sparked the email now encountered the full force of experience, calculation, and hierarchy. And in doing so, it set the stage for further maneuvering, strategy, and subtle negotiation. Moves that would ripple through the industry in ways that few could anticipate. Think about this for a moment. A single email and a single response can reveal so much about power structures, strategic thinking, and the dynamics of influence in Hollywood. It highlights how authority is exercised quietly, invisibly, and with precision. It shows that behind the glamorous facade of premieres, interviews, and social media lies a world where every word, every pause, and every reaction is scrutinized and leveraged. And it underscores a universal truth. Audacity alone is rarely enough. It must be met with experience, strategy, and control. Yet, the tension was far from over. Though the immediate response had been sent, the aftershocks were only beginning. Allies, observers, and even unintended parties would soon weigh in, each interpreting the exchange through their own lens of perception, ambition, and strategy. The narrative, carefully managed up to this point, now faced the unpredictability of human behavior and the amplifying power of media attention. In Hollywood, nothing exists in isolation. Every action generates reactions, and every reaction can shift the balance of power. And so, the chapter closes on a critical cliffhanger. The first response, delivered with precision and authority, had achieved its immediate goals, setting boundaries, asserting control, and maintaining narrative dominance. But it had also sparked the next phase of the saga, one that would test alliances, expose vulnerabilities, and challenge assumptions about audacity, authority, and the dynamics of influence in Hollywood. What happened next would escalate tensions beyond expectation, reveal hidden strategies, and force everyone involved to confront the unpredictable consequences of ambition clashing with experience. The response had been sent, but in Hollywood, no action exists in isolation. Every email, every statement, every subtle move generates waves that ripple far beyond the immediate players. Within hours, the quiet control the producer had hoped to maintain was under strain. Whispers began in corridors, private messages circulated, and the kind of speculation that feeds tabloids and gossip columns started to creep toward the public eye. It was the beginning of what would become a complex, layered fallout, and no one involved could predict where it would lead. Imagine the scene inside the studio. The senior producer, still seated at the head of the table, watches her team carefully. Assistants and strategists monitor reactions, while PR staff prepare potential contingencies in case the situation spills into the public domain. Each department had its own stakes. Legal teams worried about contracts and potential misinterpretation. Marketing strategists anticipated how fan communities might react. Creative directors pondered the impact on the James Bond franchise's brand integrity. The tension was compounded by the understanding that in Hollywood, the media's interpretation often outweighs reality. And yet, while the studio braced for external consequences, internal dynamics also began to shift. Executives who had remained silent during the initial discussions started to voice their opinions, questioning decisions, timing, and phrasing. Some argued that the response had been perfect, authoritative, precise, and firm. Others worried that even a measured reply might fuel the sender's next move, emboldening further audacity. The room became a chessboard of subtle tension, strategy, and negotiation. Every glance, every whispered comment, and every internal note could tip the balance. The sender, meanwhile, reacted with a combination of surprise and calculation. Reports indicate that she immediately recognized the precision of the response, the authority and experience behind it. Yet it also sparked a flurry of internal discussion on her side. How to leverage this audacity, how to spin it publicly, how to assert influence without appearing combative or desperate. These became her strategic priorities. Hollywood is as much about perception as action, and even a single email exchange can redefine someone's approach to influence, media presence, and negotiation. At this point, let's consider the psychology in play. Why does audacity provoke such intense reactions? Because it disrupts the invisible hierarchies of power that govern the industry. An audacious claim challenges not just authority, but the subtle rules that keep the system functioning. For the producer, maintaining control required careful balance. Asserting authority without aggression, defending institutional norms without humiliation, and preparing for potential amplification into the public sphere. Every response, therefore, became a calculated act of influence. Rumors began to emerge, fueled not by facts, but by speculation and interpretation. Did she really think she could play James Bond? Circulated in whispered hallways and private chats. How will the studio handle this audacity? Appeared in internal memos. Even outside the studio, fan forums and social media users began to debate the plausibility, motives, and consequences of the audacious request. In Hollywood, rumors are rarely innocuous. They have a tendency to shape perception, influence public sentiment, and even pressure decision-makers to act in ways they otherwise would not. The response's impact was immediate but subtle. On the one hand, it successfully established authority, asserting that audacity would not dictate outcomes. On the other, it created a ripple effect, forcing both allies and adversaries to reassess their positions, question assumptions, and anticipate future moves. For the producer, the challenge was now twofold. Manage the external fallout while also monitoring and navigating internal shifts in influence, perception, and loyalty. Consider the hidden agendas at play. Hollywood is not simply about talent. It is about alliances, networks, and leverage. Every executive, assistant, and advisor has an interest in positioning themselves advantageously. In this situation, even the quietest participant could subtly influence outcomes, shift narratives, or capitalize on the unfolding drama. One misstep in observation, one overlooked opportunity, could alter career trajectories or redefine perceived competence. It's a high-stakes game where visibility and insight are as valuable as experience. And then there was the media factor. The email and the response, while private, carried immense potential for public scrutiny. Media outlets thrive on audacity, drama, and power clashes. A leaked snippet could spark headlines, fuel debates, and even pressure the studio to act differently than planned. The producers' team knew that containment was crucial. The smallest leak could escalate into a crisis that would dominate entertainment news cycles for days, weeks, or even months. Timing, wording, and narrative control were critical components of crisis management, and every possibility was considered in real time. But here's the subtle brilliance of the scenario. Even in the midst of potential chaos, the producer's mastery of strategy and authority remained evident. She anticipated reactions, mitigated risks, and maintained a calm presence that reassured her team. That's one of the less visible aspects of Hollywood leadership. The ability to command confidence not just in public-facing decisions, but also behind closed doors, ensuring that influence, credibility, and authority remain intact even under pressure. At the same time, the audacious sender was calculating her next move. Reports suggest she considered public messaging, private negotiation, and media strategy simultaneously. Her goal was clear: maintain relevance, test boundaries, and explore any leverage she might have, all while avoiding direct conflict or reputational damage. It's a high-wire act that requires both confidence and a deep understanding of the system's levers. And in doing so, she added a layer of complexity to the fallout, forcing the studio to continuously adapt its response strategy. We also begin to see a subtle power shift emerging. While the producer had successfully asserted authority, the dynamics of the situation now involved multiple stakeholders, each interpreting audacity differently. Legal, creative, and marketing departments all had perspectives on risk, reputation, and leverage. Even minor disagreements, subtle tensions, or differences in perception could influence the final outcome. And in Hollywood, these invisible threads of influence can be just as decisive as any formal decision. Then came the first external hint of the ripple effect. A minor leak, seemingly innocuous, appeared on a fan forum. The details were vague, but it signaled that even controlled correspondence could become fodder for speculation.